Please welcome Heather. It's a long name. Heather Gordon. Okay. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, Randy, for getting us started. What'd you say? Oh, sorry, just a second. My notes seem to not want to pull up, of course. Well, I think I know the topic. I'm going to open us up with speaking about capacity building, what that might mean to us. And I'll give a little bit of a historical context about tribes' environmental capacity, what has impacted that, and kind of jumping into our next panel, which is Foundations of Indigenous Stewardship. So I'm going to kind of try and set us up for that. Oops. It vibrated. I'm not sure how to make it go. There we go. I don't know if that was me or you. Okay. Um, I wanted to just honor the lands we're on of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. I really appreciate the hosting um, and the absolute beautiful area as I flew in. I haven't, not sure I've ever been to Oregon, so it was just absolutely beautiful to see the rivers and the hills and the trees and just the absolute green everywhere. Um, I am an ocean person, but the rivers flow into the ocean, so we are all connected. I also want to recognize that as an Indigenous person, you know, I think the people here for their nurturance of the land and keeping it beautiful, and that I also recognize that you know, my acknowledgement can only really be an acknowledgement while so much of the land is still not really under Indigenous management or stewardship, um, and recognize that. All right, so just kind of building off of what Randy was saying, you know, let's really seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I wanted to call attention to that as we speak today and as we engage with our groups, just to remember that in some cultures, you know, it's important that you wait to be asked to be spoken. So if someone in your group hasn't spoken, it might be just you could ask, you know, do you have anything you'd like to add? Just sometimes giving the permission to speak is, especially if there's elders at your table. Some of our communities, we don't speak before elders, or sometimes elders speak last. So it's all different ways, but just recognizing the different cultural backgrounds um, that might that you might see in the different engagements that you're having. I want to introduce myself. I didn't know how much time I had to introduce myself earlier, so I wanted to make sure to do that now. So my full name, which Randy was saying was long, is Heather Soyak Jean Kwambokar Gordon. It's long because it tells my relative who I am and where I'm from. Um, so I am Inupiaq. I'm a tribal member of the Nome Eskimo community. The Inupiaq side of my family is from Nome and Kotzebue. Along of Soyak, my Inupiaq name is Soyak, which means drum. The drum in Inupiaq culture brings our community members together. I'm married into a Kenyan Kisi family. Culturally, in the Kisi tradition, it's paternal tribal system. So I entered the Kisi family and became a Kisi as well. So Nakora Kwa Kwamboka, I was gifted the name Kwamboka, which means crossing a bridge. But it actually means directly having a baby on a bridge. But how it's translated is that you're able to move between two cultural systems. And I will say it did take me 2 trips to pull that off before that was recognized. My Nupyak grandmother is Mary Jean Kagunayeni. She passed last February. Her mother, actually I'll jump, well, her mother is Margaret Cecilia Becker. And then my great-great-grandmother is Ella Kaguna Becker, and that's as far back as we know in our Indigenous family. And then here you see my remaining grandma, which is my, I guess, bloodline grandma's sister. And that is Velma Tonkin. I wanted to introduce a little bit more about myself. I mean, don't see me as that highfalutin person like Randy was saying, but I did get a PhD. It is in Indigenous studies though. So I'm not here to push down on anything. I'm here to listen and learn. So I'm a researcher. I'm also an evaluator, and I've provided tribal technical assistance in different positions I've had. I really work around culture as a protective factor, as well as environmental justice and climate change. So just starting off, oh my goodness, no, here we go. Okay. There was my family. Sorry, I've got my computer for my notes. And okay, so starting off lands pre-contact, I don't know if you've been to the lands.ca website. It's so awesome and fantastic. You can zoom way in, or even put in the city you live in and see all the tribal people that lived and moved across that area. So I just wanted to show lands pre-contact. Words in legislation might be traditional territories, regions of use. There's all kinds of different words that describe the lands that we lived on and nurtured for thousands of years. If I were to try and describe Indigenous environmental capacity pre-contact, I would say that there's some key aspects of it. First, the understanding that it's an ecosystem management based around a holistic kinship system. So kinship being kin, I mean, the introduction was perfect today, that the kin are the rivers, the kin are each other, the kin are the rocks, the kin are the Mother Earth, that there's this whole system that we care for and nurture because we recognize, as was explained in the opening, that these things also allow us to live and nurture us. I would say that another aspect of this was that there was sustainable use of resources. There wasn't really a lot of extinction of animals or species pre-contact. Additionally, there's a strong stewardship ethic of nurturance, recognizing that we have a really big responsibility as Indigenous people to care for the environment and to care for the world that we live in. Pre-contact, the aspects of political self-determination were intact. A lot of our communities make decision-making together. I also want to recognize in regards to some things that Randy said about dropping your titles, that a lot of cultures many of us come from don't have a lot of hierarchy in it. So like I was from a very young age, my opinion was asked just as much as anyone else's, because we all here to learn from each other and we all have different perspectives. Even like a 3-year-old child has a perspective that you might have lost 40 years ago, and they can remind you of that way to see the world. Other aspects of capacity include that understanding of cultural continuity and identity through relationship with the natural world, drawing on, you know, traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, a large ability to adapt and be resilient, and also having cultural practices and spirituality that are tied to place. Being indigenous typically was used for plants prior to people because it didn't just mean the thing, it meant that that is so tied to place. So Aboriginal was a term that was often used for indigenous people, which just meant original people. But by being indigenous, it means that we're also so connected and rooted to place. And that's, I don't know if over time you've seen the adoption of indigenous. This is some of the reasoning behind that. So I was asked to talk a little bit about capacity building or capacity and where tribal capacity might be on, or why we might be addressing why do tribes need to build capacity now? You know, and with colonization, there was a lot of different doctrines, practices, court cases, and acts that really have suppressed and not recognized and really tried to drive out tribal environmental capacity. You know, the doctrine of discovery itself, late 1400s, identified how that if there was not Christians on the land, then the land was completely empty. And so this is really the grounding for colonization worldwide. In the 1800s, after the US was formed, missionaries sent out to assimilate us into mainstream culture, removing us from those land-based and relationship-based approaches to place. When we move into the Marshall Trilogy, the Supreme Court cases, we see that the rights for tribes to sell land were removed, that tribes were considered underneath the US government, that the government was caretaking for the tribes, that they're not equals. There was a lot of federal oversight as well. Indian Removal Act, you know, we have tribes forced to relocate, which causes not only a loss of traditional lands, but disconnection from place and loss of traditional foods. And then there's just a general understanding of a lack of understanding around what tribal capacity is and what tribal capacity was and is. As we see, you know, manifest destiny, that really strong push of US settler colonialism moving westward in the United States, following by Homestead Acts, the Dawes Acts that further split up tribal lands into smaller allotments, and it created the ability to separate tribal land from one space into a checkerboard pattern. It's very hard to manage a checkerboard when you just have these separate, discrete things. Even to hunt and fish is really tricky in a checkerboard type position. We also had a lot of Christianization, assimilation practices, again, disconnecting us from the way that we see spirituality and cultural connection to the land. So overall, the colonial perspective was that tribes are just, indigenous peoples are just incapable, period. Through all those acts, what came out of it is seeing indigenous people as incapable of legal and political governance, if you think of these acts I just described, that we were incapable of being a part of modern civilization unless we were assimilated into the mainstream culture. However, then when we run into more missionaries, we see, oh, I guess indigenous people can't be assimilated at all. After the Marshall Trilogy, we have, or the Dawes Act, we have incapable of private land ownership. Indigenous people who were full blood were considered incapable of private land ownership and making those decisions of buying and selling and using the land. Incapable of developing lands, moved away from all those wealth of agriculture and moved into some really tough areas to grow and live. And so these perspectives of seeing as incapable instead of recognizing, you know, the beauty of these lands as settlers came, and completely missing the fact that those lands were nurtured, manicured, curated, cared for. They don't just look naturally the way they were looking when settlers arrived. That involved like a really strong, sustainable and coexistence relationship between peoples and lands. For just kind of a simple overview, there's this fantastic table that Haas has put out, trying to kind of sum up everything I said. We see some acts that have terminated tribes, and that literally actually said that the land would be divided away from the tribe and that the tribe does not have any sovereign rights through treaties with the U.S. government. We see hyperregulation. We see, the doctrine of discovery and removal, removing us from ancestral lands. And then these presumptions of the federal over the tribe. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ineffective consultation later, and also the lack of jurisdiction over what's happening on the lands. Is resource extraction happening, and who has rights to use the lands that indigenous people have previously lived on. So if we move from that period of pre-colonization, and we're moving into everything I just described, which is late 1700s through the 1800s, we actually see this fantastic tribal capacity for land and environment being displaced. And we see the US government noticing different resources, and we see a real lack of environmental capacity in the US government, overexploitation, inadequate regulation of land use, really no conservation practices at all, which were really harmful. Now we're seeing the results of this in like polluted waters, air pollution, land pollution, toxic waste sites. And so as tribes, environmental capacity was being eroded through these different land grabs, removal, and massacres. What was replacing it wasn't really capacity at all. It was quite an unsustainable use of the earth. Some people have said, and this is one way to think about things, that this is due to having different philosophical approaches to the earth in general. So there's this idea of human exceptionalism, which you see very much characterizing early colonialism and still somewhat today in capitalism and in modern business practice, as well as the difficulties to regulate businesses, pollution, and things like that, as the human is just separate from nature. Nature is to conquer, that idea of like Alaska's the last frontier. I'm going to go there. I'm going to like eke out my life in the wilderness. Nature is to be dominated. Nature is to be extracted. It's to be exploited. And then we have this really contrasting perspective, which is hard to find commonalities across. If you take an indigenous perspective of kinship, nurturance, and relationships, you see that the natural, spiritual, and human realms are actually all connected and a part of this worldview. And when we really see the disparity or difference, I would say, between these two perspectives, this quote, "Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish have been caught will we realize we cannot eat money." So you often see this human exceptionalism is closely tied to money. And because it's really hard to exploit something and abuse it if you actually feel a part of it, which is kind of an example of the different approaches. I'm not saying anybody in here is one way or another. I'm just recognizing these different approaches to management. So if we look at all of these things that have happened and transpired, where are we? Where are we now, leading into us all being here today? We see a lot of environmental issues in the United States, like I was talking about, due to this lack of regulation, due to this separation of human and the environment, and the idea that man is here to dominate and subjugate the animals, and everything else that needs to be used for humans. So we have a lot of issues. You're going to hear a lot, from tribal people here about, lack of access to their traditional foods, harmful toxic waste, habitat destruction, issues with dams, climate change impacts, recognizing that climate change largely comes from capitalist Western countries and industrialization. We see other U.S. environmental issues of public health risks and a lot of the challenges with, it's like, well, if this is so obvious about how this makes all these issues actually make it difficult for human beings to survive, then why wouldn't we just naturally change it? Well, we know there's these really strong interest groups, and there's a lot of money involved and political sway. So I just want to recognize that. Having been a federal employee, having been under a political, I really know the experience and difficulty of making changes, and even being listened to at all. So thinking today about, where we can start moving towards that. So I put the Obama quote there: asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And when I say that, I'm saying the US government asking for help from tribal people, who have been here and have been waiting to be recognized again for the knowledge that we have. Why do I say that? Look at non-tribal management appears to be really harmful for environment and our plant and animal kin. In Alaska, if you follow, there's been quite a lot of disasters in different rivers for different salmon populations. We have massively reduced body size of salmon. You'll hear lots of stories about that. Like literally like 100-pound king to like a 35-pound king salmon. That's a big difference. We don't see those big fish anymore. Additionally, you see that fish may also be declining, but the toxicity in the fish is increasing. So is it even a good idea to eat our traditional foods? There was a famous study that came out, gosh, probably 15 years ago now, that was saying the PCBs, this chemicals being in breast milk in Inuit women in Canada. And it was like, well, should you even breastfeed your baby? And it was, not communicated well at all. But just the extremes of that, for communities who eat a lot of fat, animals with fat, like polar bear fat, is very, very dangerous now. It's very full of PCBs and chemicals. So recognizing kind of where we are, we're in a pretty dangerous place right now, for like literally access to food. It's not only Indigenous people who eat salmon. So what can tribes manage? Like, why has this happened? If Indigenous people are so great at environmental stewardship, at nurturance, well, we kind of lost the ability to manage and the land, and now we have this checkerboarding phenomenon. So you see this, the picture on the left shows the loss of land in the lower 48 states. The picture on the bottom right of that 4 states is current tribal lands as of 1992. In the picture of Alaska, the tribal lands are, or the what is considered indigenous lands, are the tiny dark orange pieces. So in the US, tribal lands are about 1.2%, and in Alaska, 10% of our lands, but they're held mostly in corporations. And then that picture on the right is an example from California, but it's trying to show you what checkerboarding looks like and how difficult it would be to manage something if you can only manage within like a 10 by 10 acre square, and then the next square over, someone else is doing it on your left, and then above you, someone else has it, and then on your right, someone else has it. And there's a big lack of coordination. So although colonization has really tried to suppress tribal capacity, we're very resilient people. We see tribal capacity continue to be suppressed, as well as, just not having lands to manage. But there are court cases and other issues that I talked about at the beginning that limit sovereignty and jurisdiction. Tribes have experienced extensive environmental injustices through mining, ruining drinking water, and the constant proposed mines in Alaska that will, the tailings would destroy our natural world and non-human kin. There's a lot of pressure on tribes around resource extraction and development. In Alaska, we see that a lot around oil extraction. Being a Inupiaq from the Arctic, there's many people who advocate for oil extraction because it is the primary source of funding for the North Slope Borough. The whole education system, public works, is from oil tax revenue. We see tribes now being very vulnerable to climate change. In Alaska, it's very easy to see because communities are needing to be moved. But that's also happening in the Pacific Northwest. There's limited finances for tribes to be doing things like moving their communities, limited staff. We have legal and regulatory barriers, and also as opposed to indigenous management of lands, we're kind of forced into this co-management perspective just based on the fact that, you know, most tribes are not the ones owning the lands. I really like this diagram because it really shows resilience. It shows there's a lot of socioeconomic changes, you know, colonization, relocation, land fragmentation, checkerboarding, and then you see environmental change issues, you know, pollution, climate change. And through all of this, you see tribes able to adapt, transform, be resilient, and cope through indigenous knowledge, learning, collective action, and taking that self-determining agency. So tribal management thus far has shown to really protect biodiversity. Not only a long time ago, pre-contact, but this very recent study that demonstrates worldwide indigenous communities, although they don't have most of the world's land, they still protect 80% of the biodiversity that exists in the world today. And I just want to say that I really see that as a tie to this relational kinship. And when this kinship perspective is, maybe it's difficult to grasp or understand as I'm just saying words. Sarah Whalen Lunn is an Inupiaq artist, and I think she just really depicts beautifully how we view non-human and more than human kin. You see a wolf, a salmon, and a seal here, embodied with life and sentience and humanity. So I went over some of the tribal capacity issues, you know, and I talked about tribes being resilient. So what are some of the EPA capacity issues? Similar to tribes, resource constraints, they really affect everyone, and regulatory frameworks. That is something we have in common and we all struggle with. Interagency coordination is super tricky. I was in HHS, extremely difficult, even to work with DOJ, like I was working on the missing and murdered issue. HHS, DOJ, BIA, it's just nearly impossible in the experiences I had. The EPA could learn a little bit more about community engagement and decision-making, especially around their definition of what environmental justice is. There's also a lot of, like I said, different, you know, political and monetary factors having this strong influence. And there's the opportunity, like Randy said, to really build more capacity around working with tribes, local and state management organizations. Additionally, there's this threat of climate change and the need for climate resilience, and just a real lack of investment in that, as we see it just like literally an avalanche coming toward us. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to move out of the way for that one. So when we think about, well, what can we do? I mean, that was a lot of heavy, depressing stuff. But if you listened through the lines, you know, there's a lot of indigenous strength and knowledge. There's a lot of opportunity to listen and learn and support each other. There's an opportunity, instead of seeing us versus them. I don't know if you've seen that Venn diagram that shows Western knowledge versus indigenous knowledge. I tried not to show that today, to show it's not an us versus them. It's multiple ways of seeing the world and coming together. Just because, you might come up from a human exceptionalist culture, is that truly your own perspective? I was at a co-stewardship symposium in Fairbanks a few months ago, and talking to a lot of Forest Service people, which I'd never had engagement with the Forest Service, because they're in the USDA and they're not in the DOI. So that was rather interesting. But, person after person was telling me, oh yeah, I grew up near this forest. I spent my life walking through here, playing in the trees. And I was like, oh, these experiences sound exactly like the experiences I had. Um, and I think often we share a lot more in common than we think. When I have people telling me that, oh, I love to hate that indigenous knowledge is anecdotal. Let's just say that's not true and work from that today. Indigenous knowledge is based on centuries and millennia of observation, which is what the Western scientific method is also based on. Observation, trial and error, hypotheses. These are the exact same way of viewing skill building and knowledge building. And I want to emphasize, when I struggle often to communicate well with people from a very quantitative, numbers, statistical background, and they don't, they're like, oral history, meh, things not written down. I don't know if I believe that. And I'm like, well, did you ever have, your grandmother as a child tell you a story? Did you think she was lying? That everything she said is just, her experiences must be just a pile of it, like, did you sit with your grandpa? Did he ever take you out and teach you something? But you were like, no, he probably learned that from his grandpa, so it's probably just dumb. No, you didn't think that way. And we learn that way. We learn through apprenticeship. We learn through practice. Indigenous knowledge is not stuck as a philosophy. It is a daily practice that we live out and believe in, and that you're having the opportunity today as a government to learn from Indigenous people. And Indigenous people have the opportunity today to have people listen, I hope. Thinking of that it is not anecdotal, that it's based on experience and observations. And so when we think of going forward, we're going to talk about what Indigenous stewardship is. We're going to talk about what capacity looks like from the tribal and federal perspective. I just want us to think, as you do these different parts in the workbook, some things will require you to reflect on your own individual capacity. Maybe your education, maybe your experiences, maybe how you perceive things, as anecdotal or true. What is true? So that individual reflection is important. You're going to hear stories probably people are super passionate about. I'm going to say, if you try and not shout at people, but if if the emotions overwhelm, anybody, feel free to step away or find someone to chat with. But as we move from this idea of learning as an individual, then we have things within our organization, how we work with our other coworkers who might not be here today, but might still need to understand this space. That's what Randy's talking about in those modules. Then we move to working between organizations, and that's where we are today. How do we build capacity there? And ultimately, if you've read anything I've written, you will see my rant is about changing federal Indian law, policies, rules, protocols, regulations. These are some of our biggest barriers to practicing nature-based stewardship. and respecting nature and practicing indigenous understandings of conservation, which still allow use. So I have a second half of a presentation, which I'll do later, but thank you and welcome.